My greedy sister married my husband for his $500 million estate. He died days later. She confidently declared herself heir. But the lawyer's reading of his will left her speechless. My name is Gemma. I am 35 years old, and for the vast majority of my life, I was completely invisible. When I say invisible, I do not mean it in a poetic or dramatic sense. I mean it in the most literal, everyday way a person can experience. I was the ghost haunting the hallways of my own childhood home. If you want to understand how a woman could end up in the situation I eventually found myself in, you have to understand where I started. You have to understand the dynamic of my family, which was entirely defined by one blindingly bright, suffocatingly loud entity. My twin sister, Chelsea. If Chelsea was the sun, a massive, burning star that demanded every ounce of gravity and attention in our household, then I was a distant, cold asteroid, floating quietly in the dark outer edges of her orbit. We shared a womb, and we shared a birthday, but that was where the similarities ended. Chelsea was born with an infectious, chaotic energy. She was loud, demanding, beautiful in a very sharp, commanding way, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the adults around her before she could even form full sentences. My parents were absolutely captivated by her. Both of them were middle-class workers who always felt like they deserved a more glamorous life, and Chelsea was their proxy, their little golden child who was going to bring them the attention they craved. Their favoritism was not hidden. It was not subtle. It was the fundamental architecture of our home. It showed in the way my mother would spend 3 hours helping Chelsea curl her hair for a middle school dance, while tossing me a brush and telling me to just pull my hair back into a ponytail because I looked fine. It showed in the family photo albums that sat on our coffee table. If you flipped through those heavy, plastic-sleeved pages, you would see hundreds of pictures of Chelsea. Chelsea at her dance recitals, Chelsea scoring a goal, Chelsea blowing out the candles on our shared birthday cake. In almost all of those pictures, if you looked closely at the edges, you would see a sliver of my shoulder, or half of my face, literally cropped out of the frame. I was the leftover space. When we turned 16, my parents took out a second mortgage to buy Chelsea a brand new, shiny silver convertible because she had made the varsity cheerleading squad and, according to my mother, she needed a car that matched her status. I, on the other hand, walked 2 miles to a local diner every day after school to wash dishes and wipe down greasy tables just so I could save up enough to buy a rusted, second-hand bicycle. I learned very early on that if I wanted anything in this world, I had to earn it myself in silence, without expecting applause. I learned to shrink myself to fit the tiny space they allowed me to occupy. There is one specific memory that cemented my understanding of my place in the family. It is a memory that still sits heavy in my chest, even all these years later. I was 12 years old, and the winter that year was exceptionally brutal. I caught a bad cold that quickly spiraled into severe, double pneumonia. I remember the terrifying feeling of trying to pull air into my lungs and finding nothing but a sharp, burning agony, like trying to breathe in shattered glass. I was rushed to the local hospital in the middle of the night, my fever dangerously high. The doctors admitted me immediately, hooking me up to an oxygen mask and an intravenous drip of heavy antibiotics. The first night, my mother stayed in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to my bed, looking at her watch more often than she looked at me. But the second day was a Friday, which happened to be the start of a massive regional beauty pageant 3 states over. Chelsea had been preparing for it for months. The entry fees alone had cost my parents their entire savings for the year. That Friday morning, as I lay in the sterile, overly bright hospital room, struggling to breathe and feeling incredibly small, my parents stood at the foot of my bed holding Chelsea's sequined garment bags. My mother gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile. She told me that the doctors said the worst was over and that the nurses would take excellent care of me. She said it would be unfair to Chelsea to ruin her big weekend just because I had a weak immune system. My father patted my ankle through the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, told me to be a good girl, and then they left. They just walked out the door. I spent the next 4 days entirely alone in that pediatric ward. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the little black dots on the acoustic panels to distract myself from the pain in my chest. I remember eating cold hospital jelly and watching the other children on the floor get visits from their worried, hovering parents, bringing them balloons and stuffed animals. A kind, older nurse named Mrs. Higgins noticed I never had any visitors. She started bringing me extra apple juice boxes and sitting with me during her breaks to read me stories. Her pity was a warm blanket, but it also highlighted the cold reality of my existence. It was in that quiet, beeping hospital room, listening to the sounds of other people's families, that my core belief was formed. I realized that my existence was merely an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to love me most. I realized I was a burden. The moment I received my high school diploma, I knew I had to run. Staying in that house, remaining trapped in Chelsea's expanding shadow, would eventually suffocate whatever small spark of life I had left inside me. While Chelsea was throwing a massive, catered graduation party to celebrate her acceptance into an expensive, prestigious Ivy League university on the East Coast, which my parents were co-signing massive loans for, I was quietly packing my few belongings. I had applied to a small, incredibly affordable state teachers' college in Dallas, Texas. It was a 16-hour drive away from everything I knew, and that distance was its greatest selling point. The day after graduation, I loaded 2 suitcases and a box of old books into a beat-up, 10-year-old sedan I had bought from the diner owner. My parents stood on the porch and waved, looking more relieved than sad to see me go. The 16-hour drive to Texas was grueling. The air conditioning in my car was broken, the radio only picked up static-filled country stations, and my back ached from the worn-out seat. But as I crossed the state line, watching the landscape shift from familiar green hills to expansive, flat horizons, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. I cried behind the steering wheel, not from fear, but from a profound, pure relief. I was finally out of orbit. College was not a glamorous experience for me. I worked 2 minimum wage jobs to pay for my tuition and my tiny, drafty off-campus apartment. I shelved books at the university library at dawn and served cheap beer and nachos at a sports bar until midnight. I was exhausted to my very bones, but it was a peaceful exhaustion. I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. Meanwhile, Chelsea was failing out of her expensive university, partying constantly, and demanding more and more money from our parents to keep up appearances. When I graduated and got my certification, I landed a job as a 4th-grade teacher at a quiet, neighborhood elementary school. I loved the routine. I loved the children. They didn't care if I was quiet or unglamorous. They just needed someone to be patient with them, and patience was the one thing I had in endless supply. I remember a shy little girl named Fiona leaving a folded piece of lined paper on my desk at the end of my first year. Written in messy, colorful crayon were the words, "You are the best teacher in the whole world." I kept that piece of paper in my wallet for years. It was the first validation I had ever received that simply being myself was enough. I was content in my quiet, simple life. I didn't need the sun anymore. I never went looking for love. The concept of romance seemed too loud, too complicated, and completely foreign to the life I was trying to build. But love found me anyway, in the form of a man named Donovan. I met Donovan through Hannah, a fellow teacher at my school who had made it her personal mission to pull me out of my shell. She insisted I join her and her husband for a casual dinner at a local Italian restaurant, promising it was just a friendly gathering. Donovan was her husband's coworker at a mid-sized accounting firm. When I first sat down across from him at the restaurant, I was terrified. I was wearing a plain gray sweater and my hands were shaking so badly I accidentally knocked my glass of ice water straight into my own lap within the first 10 minutes. I was mortified. I expected him to laugh at me, or at least look embarrassed to be seen with me. Instead, Donovan just smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He quietly handed me a stack of napkins, flagged down the waiter to get me a fresh drink, and seamlessly changed the subject to something completely mundane to take the attention off my clumsiness. Donovan was not a flashy man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet, steady presence. He listened far more than he spoke. Over the next few weeks, as we started dating, I realized that he was the exact opposite of everything I had grown up with. He didn't try to force me into the spotlight. He didn't tell me to smile more or speak louder. He simply existed beside me, acting as a sturdy wall against the noise of the world. I remember one specific date, about 6 months into our relationship. We went to a crowded outdoor farmer's market. The noise, the pressing bodies, the screaming children, it all became too much for me. I felt a familiar, crushing panic attack rising in my chest. My vision blurred and I couldn't breathe. I grabbed Donovan's arm and whispered that I needed to leave. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He immediately wrapped his arm around my shoulders, navigated us through the thick crowd, and pulled me into a quiet, shaded alleyway behind a bakery. He sat down on a dusty concrete block, pulled me into his lap, and just held me tightly against his chest while I cried and gasped for air. He sat there for 2 solid hours, ignoring the dirt on his nice jeans, whispering that I was safe, until my heart rate returned to normal. He asked me to marry him 2 years later, on a random Tuesday evening in our living room, while we were wearing sweatpants and eating takeout Chinese food from paper cartons. There were no hidden cameras, no grand speeches, no giant diamond ring. He just looked at me over a plate of noodles, his eyes completely sincere, and said, "I want to spend the rest of my ordinary days with you. Will you be my wife?" I said yes, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Our marriage was a sanctuary. We pooled our modest savings and bought a small, older house in a quiet neighborhood lined with oak trees. For 10 years, we built a fortress of peace. We didn't take extravagant vacations or buy expensive cars. Our weekends were spent scouring estate sales and flea markets for old, beaten-up wooden furniture. I had developed a passion for sanding down ruined dressers and tables, staining the wood and bringing them back to life. It was a messy, physical process that grounded me. Donovan would sit in the garage with me, drinking coffee and doing crosswords while I worked, occasionally holding a piece of wood steady when I needed an extra hand. We adopted an older, deaf golden retriever mix named Buster from the local animal shelter. Buster was past his prime, unwanted by families looking for cute puppies, but he fit right into our quiet rhythm. We spent our evenings reading books on the couch, with Buster snoring loudly at our feet, the only sound in the house being the turning of pages and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Donovan was my rock. Whenever I doubted myself at school or felt a lingering shadow of my childhood insecurities creep in, he was there to gently remind me of my worth. He made me feel strong. During this decade, my contact with Chelsea was minimal. She had managed to land a job in public relations in New York City, largely by charming the right people rather than actually working hard. She called me maybe twice a year, usually when she had been drinking, just to boast. I would sit on the edge of my bed, holding the phone away from my ear, listening to her talk at lightning speed about her rich, hedge fund boyfriends, the designer bags she was buying, and the exclusive VIP parties she was attending. "You really should come to the city sometime, Gemma," she would say, her voice dripping with a mix of pity and condescension. "You're wasting away down there in the dirt. It's so depressing." In the past, her words would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. But securely anchored in Donovan's love, her insults just bounced off me. I would politely tell her that I was happy for her, wish her well, and hang up the phone to go back to my husband and my dog. I felt sorry for her, in a way. She was constantly running, constantly consuming, desperate to fill a void that I had managed to fill with simple, quiet love. I thought I was safe. I thought the walls of my little fortress were impenetrable. The crack in my foundation started quietly, like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall. It began with the unexpected return of my sister. Chelsea's glamorous life in New York had imploded in spectacular fashion. The wealthy fiancé she had been bragging about for the last 8 months had suddenly dumped her, and she had subsequently lost her PR job due to poor performance. Having burned through all her credit cards and alienated her friends in the city, she retreated to the only safety net she knew, Texas. Our parents were ecstatic, of course. They helped her rent a sleek, overpriced condo downtown, acting as if she was a conquering hero returning home for a rest, rather than a 35-year-old woman running away from her failures. Suddenly, Chelsea was a constant, irritating presence in my life again. She would drop by our house unannounced, usually wearing expensive loungewear and carrying a bottle of wine she expected us to open for her. She complained endlessly about the heat, the people, the lack of culture, and how boring my life was. Donovan was always polite to her, offering her a glass of water and then retreating to his home office, leaving me to manage the hurricane. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between the electric bill and a grocery store flyer. It was a thick, heavy envelope from a prominent law firm in Chicago, addressed solely to Donovan. When he opened it after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table, I saw all the color drain from his face. He read the thick stack of legal documents 3 times in absolute silence. "Donovan? Is everything okay?" I asked, wiping down the counters. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and unreadable. "It's about my great-uncle Silas," he said, his voice strangely hollow. "He passed away a few weeks ago." I vaguely knew about Uncle Silas. Donovan rarely spoke of him. He was the black sheep of his extended family, a ruthless, abrasive man who had made a fortune in industrial mining and lived as a recluse in the Midwest. "I'm so sorry, honey," I said, putting down my dish towel. "Are we going to a funeral?" "No," Donovan said, staring at the papers. He didn't want a funeral. But he left me his estate. All of his corporate shares in the mining conglomerate. Over the next few weeks, the whisper of the inheritance grew into a deafening roar. Donovan was constantly on the phone behind closed doors, talking in hushed, stressed tones to lawyers and accountants. The rumor, validated by a few obscure financial blogs tracking the mining company, was staggering. The estate, the corporate empire he was suddenly the primary beneficiary of, was valued at roughly $500 million. $500 million. It was a number so large it felt completely abstract, like Monopoly money. It terrified me. I didn't want $500 million. I just wanted my quiet life. But the money changed the atmosphere in our house. It hung in the air like a thick humidity. And then came the Sunday afternoon that ruined everything. Chelsea had come over, uninvited as usual, lounging on my sofa and filing her nails. Donovan was in his office, the door slightly ajar. He was on a conference call, his voice raised in frustration. "I understand the valuation is at $500 million, Donovan was saying loudly through the crack in the door. "Yes, $500 million. I know. I just need to figure out the logistics of the transfer. Just send the executor paperwork." I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, but I saw it happen. I saw Chelsea stop filing her nails. I saw her sit up straight, her neck craning toward the hallway. The look that washed over her face was something I will never forget. It wasn't surprise. It was a raw, primal hunger. It was the look of a starving wolf locking eyes on a wounded deer. Her gaze shifted from the hallway to me, standing in my worn-out apron, and a slow, calculating smile spread across her perfect lips. She had caught the scent of the fortune, and in that split second, I knew she had decided she wanted it. She wanted the empire, and to get it, she was going to have to take my husband. Before I continue telling you about the darkest days of my life and how my sister slowly destroyed my family, if you empathize with this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. The transformation of my husband did not happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing process, like watching a photograph left out in the sun gradually fade until you can no longer recognize the faces in it. Looking back now, I can see how meticulously he orchestrated every single detail, but at the time, I was completely blind to the performance. I was just a woman watching her entire world crumble piece by piece. It started with his schedule. Donovan had always been a man of routine. He was home by 6 every evening, and we would cook dinner together. But a few weeks after the news of the $500 million inheritance broke, his hours became erratic. He claimed the legal complexities of transferring a corporate empire of that magnitude required endless meetings with financial advisors, tax attorneys, and board members. He started coming home at 9, then 10, and eventually, sometimes not until past midnight. I would leave a plate of food wrapped in the refrigerator, but it would remain untouched the next morning. Then came the coldness. The man who used to hold me for hours in an alleyway to calm my panic attacks suddenly could not stand to be in the same room as me. If I tried to touch his shoulder, he would flinch and pull away, muttering that he was too stressed, too tired, or had a headache. The silence in our house, which used to be a comforting blanket, mutated into a suffocating, heavy fog. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, terrified that any sudden movement or wrong word would cause him to shatter. Instead of confronting him immediately, I retreated inward. My childhood trauma reared its ugly head, convincing me that this was entirely my fault. I told myself that I was not smart enough to support a man who was about to become a multimillionaire CEO. I was just a boring fourth-grade teacher who liked to sand down old garbage furniture. Why would a man with a $500 million empire want to stay in a tiny oak-lined neighborhood with me? And then I started finding the clues. They were clumsy, almost too obvious, but my mind was so frantic I didn't question their legitimacy. I found a receipt for an expensive steakhouse in the pocket of his suit jacket, a dinner for two, paid in cash, dated on a night he told me he was stuck in a conference room eating stale sandwiches. A few days later, while doing the laundry, I caught a scent lingering on the collar of his dress shirt. It was not the faint smell of his usual aftershave. It was heavy, floral, and aggressively expensive. It was the exact custom blended perfume that Chelsea wore. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that maybe she had just bumped into him at his office building, or maybe my mind was playing cruel tricks on me because of my deep-seated insecurities regarding my sister. But the signs kept multiplying. I would walk into his home office, and he would immediately snap his laptop shut, his face flushed. I noticed a hotel key card half hidden under a stack of papers on his desk. I was losing my mind. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling like the unwanted, invisible little girl in the hospital room all over again. The paranoia was eating me alive, and I knew I could not survive in this agonizing limbo for much longer. The physical toll of my anxiety was impossible to hide. Within a month, I had lost 10 pounds. The dark circles under my eyes looked like bruises, and my hands shook constantly. I could barely focus on my students at school. Hannah, my dear friend, constantly pulled me aside in the teacher's lounge, asking me what was wrong, but I just forced a weak smile and blamed it on a lingering stomach bug. I was too ashamed to admit that my husband, the love of my life, was slipping through my fingers, and I strongly suspected my own twin sister was the one pulling him away. I finally reached my breaking point on a rainy Thursday evening. Donovan had come home relatively early for once, around 8 o'clock. He walked through the front door, dropped his leather briefcase on the floor, and headed straight for the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, not even acknowledging my presence on the sofa. I stood up. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk into the kitchen. I asked him, my voice trembling, if there was someone else. I asked him about the perfume, the receipts, the late nights. I begged him to just tell me the truth, no matter how much it hurt, because the uncertainty was destroying me. Donovan did not look guilty. He did not look apologetic. He turned around, leaned against the counter, and looked at me with an expression of utter disgust. It was a look so cold, so entirely foreign to the man I married, that it literally knocked the breath out of my lungs. He laughed. A harsh, cruel sound. He called me pathetic. He told me that my paranoia was suffocating him, that I was acting like a crazy, insecure child who was dragging him down. And then, he delivered the killing blow. He looked me dead in the eye and said the words that shattered my reality. He told me he wanted a divorce. I froze. I asked him why, the words scraping out of my dry throat. He said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion, that his life was changing. He was inheriting a massive corporate entity. He was going to be moving in circles of power and wealth. And he looked at my worn-out sweater and my messy hair and told me that he needed a woman with ambition. He needed a partner who understood the cutthroat nature of the world, someone who could stand by a powerful man, not a woman who spent her weekends fixing up garbage trash in the garage. He said he was tired of my small, insignificant life. Those words were precision-guided missiles aimed directly at my deepest vulnerabilities. They echoed every insult, every dismissive sigh my parents and my sister had ever directed at me. I collapsed against the kitchen island, unable to stand, tears streaming down my face, begging him to reconsider, begging him to remember our 10 years of quiet joy. But his face remained an unreadable mask of stone. Before I could even process the reality of the divorce, before I could gather enough oxygen into my lungs to speak another word, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, cheerful chime that echoed horribly through the tense silence of the house. Donovan calmly walked past my sobbing form, went to the front door, and opened it. I heard the familiar, confident click-clack of high heels on the hardwood floor. I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my eyes, and my heart completely stopped. Standing in my hallway, wearing a stunning, tailored crimson dress and carrying a designer overnight bag, was my sister, Chelsea. She walked right past me, the heavy scent of her floral perfume instantly filling the air, the exact same perfume I had smelled on Donovan's shirt. She walked directly to my husband, looped her arm intimately through his, and leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not pull away. He simply placed his hand over hers. I felt the room spinning. I thought I might actually lose consciousness. My sister. My own flesh and blood. And my husband. Chelsea looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my tear-stained face, my trembling hands, my ordinary clothes. And then she smiled. It was a wide, predatory, triumphant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won the ultimate prize. She announced, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet venom, that she and Donovan were together. She told me that they had found a connection that I could never possibly understand, a connection built on ambition and true power. And then she delivered the line she had been waiting her entire life to say to me. She told me that I had always lived in her shadow, and it was finally time for me to stay there for good. The next few weeks were a blur of absolute bureaucratic cruelty. Donovan wanted the divorce finalized immediately. He hired a ruthless legal team to expedite the process. I was in a state of complete paralysis, a walking ghost. I did not fight. I did not argue. I just wanted to escape the suffocating presence of their betrayal. During the settlement negotiations, Donovan's lawyer presented me with an offer that, at the time, I thought was driven by extreme guilt. Donovan insisted on signing over our house, all of his personal savings accounts, his personal retirement fund, and his life insurance policy entirely to me. In exchange, I had to sign an ironclad waiver, completely severing myself from any legal or financial claim to the $500 million inheritance and the mining conglomerate. Donovan sat across from me at the massive mahogany conference table, refusing to meet my eyes. He told the lawyer to just give me the pennies so he could secure his billion-dollar legacy without any loose ends. Chelsea sat next to him, tracing circles on his arm, looking incredibly bored by the discussion of his mere personal savings. She only cared about the corporate shares. I signed every document they slid across the table. I packed my clothes, my books, and my dog Buster into my old car. I left the keys to the house on the kitchen counter because I could no longer bear to look at the walls we had painted together. I walked out of the life I had built, leaving my sister to rule over the ashes. I could not bear to stay in the house, even though he had given it to me. The memories were too thick, too painful. I quickly sold it and used the money to rent a dreary, small apartment in an older, anonymous complex on the other side of town. My new landlord was a quiet, elderly man named Mr. Dalton, who communicated mostly in grunts and nods, which suited me perfectly. I did not want to speak to anyone. For the first 2 months, my apartment was a purgatory of cardboard. I could not bring myself to unpack. I slept on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by sealed boxes containing the remnants of a life that felt like a distant, cruel joke. Buster, my faithful old dog, would rest his chin on my legs, sensing my profound sorrow, offering quiet whines of comfort. I survived on canned soup and crackers, rarely turning on the lights. I ignored the outside world completely. Hannah called me relentlessly, leaving increasingly worried voicemails, but I could not bring myself to answer. What could I possibly say to her? How do you articulate the humiliation of being discarded so easily by the two people who were supposed to be your family? I felt hollowed out, scraped entirely clean of any self-worth. Despite blocking both Donovan and Chelsea on every platform imaginable, the toxic reach of my extended family made sure I was kept updated. A distant cousin, under the guise of fake sympathy, emailed me a screenshot from Chelsea's social media. It was a picture of Chelsea and Donovan clinking crystal champagne flutes on the balcony of a luxury hotel overlooking the ocean. The caption simply read, "Soulmates. Ready to conquer the empire." Seeing his face, looking so calm next to her triumphant smile, made me physically ill. I threw up in my small, dingy bathroom. I realized then that my sister was not just content with taking my life, she wanted to make sure I watched her enjoy it. Over the next few weeks, I received several anonymous emails from burner accounts. The messages were short, vicious, and unmistakably written in Chelsea's voice. They mocked my pathetic existence, asked if I was enjoying my cardboard boxes, and reminded me that winners take all. She was kicking me while I was already buried in the dirt. I felt like I was drowning in an ocean of gray, unable to find the surface. My turning point did not come from a therapy session or an inspiring book. It came from an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. About 3 months into my isolation, I realized I had completely run out of dog food for Buster. I had no choice but to venture out into the world. I threw on a pair of baggy sweatpants, tied my unwashed hair into a knot, and drove to the local grocery store. I looked terrible, pale, thin, and entirely defeated. As I was walking out of the sliding glass doors, carrying a heavy bag of kibble, a sleek, black Mercedes sedan pulled up directly to the curb in front of me. The tinted window rolled down. My heart seized. Sitting in the driver's seat, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a massive, blinding diamond engagement ring, was Chelsea. She had actually tracked me down. She had taken time out of her supposedly glamorous, busy life just to find me at a suburban grocery store. She stepped out of the car, looking immaculate in a tailored cream suit. She walked toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. She pulled off her sunglasses, and the fake, saccharine smile on her face made my skin crawl. She looked me up and down, taking in my sweatpants and my hollow eyes. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh of pity. She told me I looked absolutely dreadful and asked if I was having trouble adjusting to my new, lowly reality. She offered, in a tone dripping with extreme condescension, to write me a small check if I was struggling to buy food for my dirty dog. I just stood there, gripping the bag of dog food so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then she leaned in closer, dropping the fake sympathy. Her voice turned into a venomous whisper. She told me that this was exactly where I belonged. She said I was genetically inferior, a weak, broken little bird who never had the strength to hold on to a real man. She said Donovan was repulsed by my weakness and that he thanked her every day for rescuing him from my pathetic, small life. She expected me to cry. She expected me to crumble onto the pavement and beg for mercy. That was the dynamic we had operated on our entire lives. But as I looked at her smug, arrogant face, something inside me shifted. The heavy, numb fog of depression that had clouded my brain for months suddenly burned away, incinerated by a sudden, white-hot flash of pure rage. I realized she was a monster. An empty, greedy, soulless monster who fed on the pain of others. And I realized I was done feeding her. I stood up straight, towering over her slightly. I didn't yell. My voice was dangerously calm, low, and steady. I told her to get back into her car. I told her that she was a parasite and that whatever miserable life she thought she had stolen from me was hers to keep, because I would rather be dead than share a single drop of blood with her. Chelsea's smile vanished. She looked genuinely taken aback by the ice in my voice. She opened her mouth to snap back, but I just turned around, walked to my old car and drove away, leaving her standing alone on the curb. That anger saved my life. It became the fuel I needed to claw my way out of the abyss. The next morning, I called Hannah. I apologized for shutting her out, and she came over immediately with coffee and cleaning supplies. I went back to the school district and begged for my teaching job back. They graciously reinstated me. I also went back to the one thing that always brought me peace. I went to a local thrift store, bought a horribly damaged, water-stained wooden table, and dragged it into the small patch of grass behind my apartment. I bought heavy grit sandpaper and I started stripping the table. I sanded the wood aggressively, working until my arms ached and my fingers were blistered. With every layer of ruined varnish I scraped away, I felt like I was stripping away the trauma, the betrayal, and the toxic shadow of my sister. I was slowly, painstakingly revealing the solid, unbroken core underneath. I spent the next year quietly rebuilding myself. I was no longer the invisible twin. I was just Gemma, and I was stronger than I had ever been. A full year passed. The intense pain had settled into a dull, manageable ache. I had found a new rhythm to my life. I loved my students, I spent my weekends restoring furniture, and I had saved up enough money from my teaching salary and the settlement funds Donovan had left me to start looking for a small house to buy. I had successfully excised my sister and my ex-husband from my mind. I considered them dead to me. Then, on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. I was in my empty classroom, wiping down the whiteboard after the children had gone home. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but for some inexplicable reason, I answered. A professional, somber male voice asked if he was speaking to Gemma. I confirmed my identity. The man introduced himself as Gregory, a senior partner at a downtown law firm. My stomach tightened. Why was a lawyer calling me? My first paranoid thought was that Chelsea had somehow found a way to sue me for my meager savings just out of pure spite. But then Gregory spoke the words that stopped the rotation of the earth beneath my feet. He told me, in a very gentle, measured tone, that he was calling regarding Donovan. He paused, letting a heavy silence stretch over the line, before informing me that Donovan had suffered a massive, catastrophic heart failure the previous night and had passed away instantly. I dropped the whiteboard eraser. It hit the linoleum floor with a dull thud. The colorful alphabet posters on the wall blurred into streaks of color. Dead? Donovan was dead? It made absolutely no sense. He was only 38 years old. He was healthy. He was supposed to be busy ruling a corporate empire with my sister. I stammered, asking why he was calling me. We had been divorced for over a year. Surely, he should be calling his grieving fiancée, Chelsea. Gregory cleared his throat. He explained that while Chelsea was indeed the primary beneficiary of the corporate estate, Donovan had left a secondary, highly confidential file with his firm. He stated that Donovan had left strict, legally binding instructions that in the event of his death, Gregory was to contact me directly and privately. He told me there was a letter. A personal letter written by Donovan, completely separate from his official will, that he demanded be placed directly into my hands before any other legal proceedings took place. I was dizzy with confusion, residual anger, and a sudden, shocking wave of grief. I agreed to meet him at his office the very next morning. I drove home in a daze, Buster resting his head on my lap the whole way, sensing the chaotic storm raging inside my mind. The law office of Attorney Gregory was located on the 20th floor of a sleek glass building. I sat in a heavy leather chair across from his massive desk, my hands trembling in my lap. Gregory offered his condolences, his eyes full of a strange, profound pity that I did not understand. He opened a locked drawer in his desk, pulled out a simple white envelope with my name written on it, and slid it across the polished wood. The handwriting was unmistakably Donovan's. Neat, steady, familiar. I broke the seal with shaking fingers and pulled out 3 pages of closely written text. The letter began with an apology so deep and desperate it practically bled through the paper. He wrote that if I was reading this, his time had finally run out. He explained everything. Over a year ago, right around the time the news of his uncle's inheritance broke, Donovan had gone to the doctor for persistent chest pains. He was diagnosed with an aggressive, terminal form of cardiomyopathy. His heart was rapidly failing. The doctors gave him 12 to 18 months to live at best. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob. He had been dying. The entire time he was pulling away from me, the entire time he was acting cold, he was dying. But the revelation did not stop there. The letter detailed his investigation into his great-uncle's $500 million estate. When his lawyers finally dug into the corporate accounts of the mining conglomerate, they discovered a horrifying truth. The empire was an illusion. The company was facing massive, devastating legal action. They had severely violated federal environmental regulations for decades, resulting in over $300 million in pending fines from the Environmental Protection Agency. Furthermore, the company was being actively investigated for massive corporate tax fraud by the Federal Tax Agency, the IRS, carrying penalties and back taxes exceeding $400 million. The estate was not worth $500 million. It was a toxic, radioactive trap carrying over $700 million in unpayable debt, legal liabilities, and criminal investigations. Whoever officially accepted the role of executor and primary beneficiary of those corporate shares would be legally assuming responsibility for the entire collapsing house of cards. They would be bankrupted, dragged through federal courts, and potentially face prison time for the corporate negligence. Donovan wrote that his first thought was to simply reject the inheritance. But then, he saw the look in Chelsea's eyes that day in our house. He knew my sister. He knew her bottomless greed, her absolute ruthlessness, and her lifelong desire to destroy me. He realized that if he simply died of his heart condition while we were still married, Chelsea would undoubtedly find a way to contest his will, drag me into a brutal legal battle, and perhaps even try to force the toxic estate onto my shoulders through legal loopholes to ruin me. So, he formulated a plan. A terrifying, heartbreaking masterpiece of a plan to protect me. I read the final page of the letter through a thick veil of tears, the words blurring and swimming before my eyes. Donovan confessed that he had to make Chelsea want the estate so desperately that she would blind herself to the risks. He had to manufacture the affair. He bought the expensive perfume. He left the hotel receipts. He deliberately pushed me away with the cruelest words he could think of, words he knew would cut me to the bone. He wrote that calling me pathetic and asking for a divorce was the single most agonizing moment of his life, but he knew he had to break my heart to save my future. He forced the divorce quickly so he could legally transfer all of his clean, liquid assets, his savings, the retirement funds, the house, entirely to me, severing me completely from his financial profile. Once I was safe behind a legal firewall, he lured Chelsea in. He promised her the title of a billionaire's wife. He named her the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the mining conglomerate in his official will. He built a magnificent, glittering, golden cage, and he held the door open while my greedy sister sprinted inside and locked it behind herself. His final words on the page were a plea for forgiveness. He told me he never stopped loving me, not for a fraction of a second, and that his only solace in his final, painful months was knowing that I would be safe, well-funded, and entirely free from the shadow of my family forever. I dropped the letter onto the desk and wept. I wept with a ferocity that shook my entire body. I cried for the husband I had hated for a year, the man who had sacrificed his reputation, his marriage, and his own peace of mind just to build an impenetrable fortress around me. He was not a traitor. He was my protector until his very last breath. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Donovan had predicted. I attended his funeral, standing quietly in the back. Chelsea was in the front row, wearing a dramatically large black hat and a designer mourning dress, putting on a spectacular performance of grief. She had no idea she was weeping over the man who had just handed her a ticking time bomb. Less than 3 weeks after the funeral, the illusion shattered. Chelsea, eager to claim her throne, signed all the executor documents, officially taking ownership of the corporate shares. Almost immediately, the Federal Tax Agency and the Environmental Protection Agency swooped in. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her condo was seized. The luxury cars were repossessed. She was buried under an avalanche of federal lawsuits and hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate debt that she was now legally tied to. She had wanted the empire, and she got it. Every single toxic, rotting piece of it. It's been 2 years now. Chelsea is completely bankrupt, facing multiple lawsuits, and is currently living in a tiny, run-down motel. Through a mutual relative, she recently sent me a long, tearful letter begging for forgiveness and asking for financial help, saying we are still blood. I burned the letter. But sometimes, late at night, a tiny fraction of the old me wonders. Am I wrong for abandoning my own sister in her darkest hour? Should I accept her apology and help her out of the trap my husband set for her? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. If you found yourself invested in this journey, please hit that like button. It truly helps the channel out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on another daily story. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.